July of 2010, Charleston, South Carolina. Inside the medical intensive care unit at the Ralph H. Johnson Veterans Affairs Medical Center, a quiet experiment was underway. 8 hospital rooms looked exactly like the 8 beside them. Same beds, same monitors, same shift of nurses, same cleaning protocol. Nothing had changed in the way the staff worked. But 6 small objects in those rooms had been swapped out. The bed rails, the overbed tray tables, the IV poles, the chair arms, the nurse call buttons, and the bezels around the computer monitors, each replaced with surfaces made of copper alloy. For nearly a year, every patient who walked through those doors was assigned at random. Half went to copper rooms, half went to standard rooms. Every infection, every culture, every blood draw was tracked. By the time the trial closed in June of 2011, the pattern in the data was unmistakable. Patients in the copper rooms developed hospital-acquired infections at less than half the rate of those in the standard rooms, a 58% reduction. The replaced surfaces made up less than 10% of the total area in the room, and yet more than half of the infections vanished. The trial, funded by the United States Department of Defense and conducted across 3 sites, the Medical University of South Carolina, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, and the Charleston VA, was published in 2013 in the journal Infection Control and Hospital Epidemiology. The result was statistically significant, peer-reviewed, replicated, and it raised a question that almost no one in the news cycle bothered to ask. If a metal that has been part of human civilization for 6,000 years can do this in an intensive care unit, what is it doing absent from one of the most contaminated rooms in the average house? This is Oracle Prime. And tonight, the trail leads from a Charleston hospital ward to the inside of a bathroom drain, and to a piece of hardware that costs less than a cup of coffee. Part 1. The living city in the bathroom. Most homes have one room where biology is in charge. It is warm. It is wet. It is dark for most of the day. And it is layered, year after year, with the slow architecture of biofilm. That black, gray, sometimes pinkish film along the grout, around the drain, behind the shower head. It is not soap scum. It is not dirt. It is a living city. Microbiologist Norman Pace and his team at the University of Colorado Boulder published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They sampled around 50 showerheads from 9 cities across 7 states, including New York, Chicago, and Denver. Roughly 30% of those showerheads harbored significant levels of Mycobacterium avium, a pathogen linked to pulmonary disease. Mycobacteria had concentrated to levels more than 100 times higher than the municipal water flowing through the pipe. Pace's team also tried something most homeowners would try. They cleaned a heavily contaminated showerhead with a bleach solution. Months later, they tested it again. The bleach treatment had caused a 3-fold increase in the very bacteria they were trying to kill. The chemical wiped out the surface layer, but the survivors regrew stronger, sealed inside the biofilm matrix where chlorine could not reach them. A follow-up study in 2018, led by researchers at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences and published in the journal MBio, sampled showerheads in 656 households across the United States and Europe. The pattern held. Mycobacteria were more abundant in U.S. homes than European ones, more abundant in municipal tap water than in well water. And the regions where pathogenic mycobacteria thrived inside showerheads matched the regions where non-tuberculous mycobacterial lung infections were most common in the population. Every morning, tens of millions of people in modern cities step into a fine warm mist that has been brewing all night inside a plastic biofilm reactor. The gap between cultural belief and biological reality could not be wider. The shower, that great symbol of modern hygiene, is one of the dirtier surfaces in the home. Part 2. A solution that was found and then forgotten. The strange part is that humanity already solved this problem twice, and then misplaced the answer. Walk through any museum collection of ancient Egyptian medical artifacts and look closely. Copper instruments, copper drinking vessels. Egyptian medical writings dating to roughly 2400 BC referenced copper for sterilizing water and dressing wounds. The Greeks and Romans inherited the practice. They had no microscope. They knew nothing of bacteria. They simply observed that water stored in copper did not turn rancid as quickly, and that wounds dressed with copper compounds healed cleaner. 2,000 years of empirical observation, embedded in the daily life of empires. Then jump forward to the year 1832. Cholera was tearing through Paris. The disease would return in 1849, again in 1852, again in 1854, again in 1865. Each wave killed thousands. In the middle of those decades of dying, a French physician named Victor Burq made an observation that nobody followed up on for more than a century. Burq visited a copper smelter in the 3rd arrondissement of Paris. The conditions inside were grim. Poor sanitation, cramped housing, hard labor. The kind of place where cholera should have devastated the workforce. Yet, the 200 employees of that smelter had survived every epidemic untouched. Burq looked wider. He found that another 400 to 500 copper workers living on the same street had also been spared. He kept looking. Across the records of the city's jewelers, goldsmiths, and boilermakers, the pattern repeated. By the 1865 epidemic, out of roughly 30,000 people working in the Paris copper trades, only 45 had died of cholera. Burq submitted his findings to the French Academy of Sciences. He suggested that contact with copper, somehow, was acting as a preventive shield. The medical community, busy with the simultaneous emergence of germ theory under Pasteur and Koch, mostly shelved the report. Some of Burke's other claims, he advocated, for example, ingesting copper sulfate as a treatment for unrelated conditions, did not hold up under further scrutiny. And that became the easy excuse to discard the rest. The cholera observation went into a drawer. A few decades later, a Swiss botanist named Carl Nägeli was studying microorganisms in water. He observed that single-celled organisms died when placed in water that had merely been stored in copper containers, even when no copper residue was visible. He gave the phenomenon a name, the oligodynamic effect, the killing power of trace amounts of certain metals. Once again, the finding made it into scientific journals, and once again, the world moved on to other priorities. Then came the 20th century. Stainless steel was cheaper. Plastic was cheaper still. Copper plumbing remained in use, but copper as a hygiene principle was abandoned for a polished, bright, antiseptic aesthetic that looked clean to the eye. The illusion of cleanliness replaced the actual mechanism of it. And the cleaning products industry, an enormous global market, grew up to fill the gap with bottles, sprays, refills, and subscription deliveries. Part 3. What copper actually does to a microbe. A century after Nägeli, microbiologists circled back to the question with modern instruments. What is copper doing, exactly, when a microorganism touches it? The process is called contact killing, and the mechanism is now well documented. When a bacterium settles on a copper surface, the metal slowly releases positively charged copper ions into whatever moisture is clinging to the cell. Bacterial cell walls carry a negative charge. The ions are pulled in. They attach. They destabilize the membrane and punch holes through the outer wall. The cell begins to leak. That is only the first move. Once copper ions are inside the cell, they catalyze what chemists call Fenton-type reactions. These reactions generate reactive oxygen species, unstable molecules that essentially set fire to the cell's internal machinery. Proteins denature. Lipids oxidize. The metabolic system collapses from within. Finally, The ions reach the genetic core, fragmenting strands of DNA and RNA. The cell cannot repair itself. It cannot pass on what killed it. That last point is what separates copper from almost every other antimicrobial humanity has ever invented. Antibiotics target a single mechanism. Survivors evolve resistance. Resistance spreads. That is how the modern superbug crisis was born. Copper attacks the cell on at least 4 fronts simultaneously: membrane, proteins, oxidative stress, and DNA, and shreds the genome itself. Resistance to that kind of multi-front assault is exceptionally rare. There are documented copper tolerance genes, like COP-A, in some environmental bacterial strains, and serious researchers do not pretend bacteria are completely defenseless. But compared to the speed at which bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics, the contrast is stark. In February of 2008, the United States Environmental Protection Agency took an unusual step. It registered copper alloys as antimicrobial public health materials, the first solid surface in EPA history to receive that registration. The original list included 275 alloys, all containing at least 65% copper. Today, more than 500 copper alloy chemistries are registered. The official EPA-approved claim, supported by good laboratory practice testing, is that copper alloy surfaces continuously kill greater than 99.9% of bacteria, including MRSA, E. coli 0157H7, and Staphylococcus aureus, within 2 hours of contact. That is not a marketing line. That is a federal regulatory finding, repeatable across independent laboratories. Part 4. Why hospitals did not immediately convert. So why are hospitals not encrusted in copper? Why is every ICU not the Charleston ICU? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is something much more honest and much more frustrating. Copper alloy bed rails cost more upfront than steel ones. Copper IV poles cost more than aluminum. A hospital procurement committee staring at a quarterly budget sees the line item, not the downstream savings from infections that never happened. There is no patent on copper, so no manufacturer has spent millions of dollars marketing copper bed rails to hospital administrators the way pharmaceutical companies market drugs. There is no quarterly earnings call where a copper executive promises 10% growth on cleaning consumables. That is the real story. Copper was forgotten not because someone hid it, but because nobody had a financial incentive to remind the world. A solution that lasts decades is a poor business model in an economy built on refills. There is also a layer of genuine scientific caution worth acknowledging. Some hospital infection control specialists argue that improving hand hygiene compliance and standard cleaning protocols delivers more value per dollar than retrofitting surfaces. They are not wrong. Bleach kills bacteria when applied correctly. Hydrogen peroxide and enzyme-based drain cleaners can dissolve early-stage biofilm. These tools work, and any honest discussion of household hygiene includes them. The case for copper is not that everything else fails. The case is that copper provides something none of those tools can provide alone: continuous, passive, 24-hour activity that does not stop the moment the cleaner has been wiped away. Part 5. Putting it to work at home. Which leads finally to the bathroom and the hardware store. The principle is simple. Wherever water stagnates, wherever biofilm forms, the surface contacting that water can be made unfriendly to microbes by introducing exposed copper. The hardware does not need to be elaborate. It needs to be bare. The simplest version uses uncoated copper wire, 18 gauge or thicker, available in any hardware store for a few dollars per spool. The word that matters is uncoated. Many wires sold for electrical work carry a thin lacquer or enamel that blocks ion release entirely. Beautiful shiny copper sealed under varnish is doing nothing. A quick rub with sandpaper removes the coating. The metal needs to breathe into the moisture around it. Coiled loosely, and dropped into a bathroom sink drain or shower drain. Exposed copper sits in the wettest part of the system. As organic material, hair, soap residue, dead skin, flows past the metal, the moisture carries trace ions onto the biofilm coating the pipe walls. The biofilm matrix is disrupted. Slime production slows. Odors fade. This particular application has not been validated by a peer-reviewed home study, and Oracle Prime will not pretend otherwise. But the underlying chemistry is the same chemistry the EPA validated for hospital surfaces. The mechanism does not stop at the hospital door. The device Pace's research identified as a mycobacterium reactor. A length of bare copper wire can be wrapped around the threads where the head meets the pipe, or coiled inside the chamber behind the spray plate, where water actively passes through. Copper does its work in the seconds the water spends in contact with it. For the wet edges where black mold tends to bloom, the seam at the base of a tub, the corner of a tiled wall, the underside of a shower curtain hem. Narrow strips of copper mesh, the kind sold for sealing rodent entry points, can be embedded into fresh caulk along the joint. Once the caulk cures, the mesh provides a continuous, low-grade copper ion source along the wettest line of the room. Maintenance is the part that gets overlooked. Copper oxidizes. A patina builds up. Depending on its composition, that patina can either continue to release ions or seal the surface and reduce activity. Every 2 to 3 months, the copper should be removed, scrubbed with a paste of lemon juice and salt, or briefly soaked in white vinegar, then returned to service. Bright copper is active copper. Part 6. Honest Limits. A responsible video ends with limits, not promises. A copper coil in a drain does not replace cleaning. It is not a substitute for ventilation. It will not rescue a bathroom whose mold problem is actually a hidden leak inside the wall. If black spots are spreading across drywall or ceiling, the copper is the wrong tool. The right tools are a moisture meter, a plumber, and possibly a remediation contractor. The strategy is also not appropriate for every household. Homes with very young children, immune-compromised members, or copper plumbing already releasing significant dissolved copper into the drinking water should be cautious. The EPA's drinking water limit for copper is set at 1.3 milligrams per liter for a reason. Copper is essential to human nutrition in trace amounts and toxic in large ones. A coil of wire dropped into a drain releases far below any concerning level. But layering copper indiscriminately throughout the water system is not the goal. And one more honest note. The strongest data on copper-killing microbes comes from controlled laboratory conditions. Flat alloy surfaces, measured inoculations, fixed exposure times. Real bathrooms have soap scum, uneven exposure, fluctuating temperatures. Real-world performance is reduction, not elimination. The honest claim is fewer microbes, slower biofilm, fresher pipes, not a sterile bathroom. Inside those caveats, copper does something bleach cannot. It works while the household sleeps. It does not evaporate. It does not need to be reapplied. It is the closest thing in domestic hygiene to a passive defense system, drawing on the same atomic property that has been quietly killing pathogens since the Bronze Age. Closing. Back to Charleston. Back to Charleston. Back to the ICU. When the Soldado team published the 58% finding in 2013, the medical world did not transform overnight. A handful of hospitals adopted copper components. Most did not. The cost difference, multiplied across an entire facility, was simply too large for budgets built around quarterly accounting. The same logic that has slowed copper's return to hospitals is the logic that kept it out of homes for the better part of a century. A cultural preference for cleanliness that arrives in a bottle, gets used up, and requires another trip to the store. The metal itself does not care. It has been killing microbes since long before there was a word for microbes. The same atomic property that protected copper smelters from cholera in 1852 protected ICU patients in 2010. And that same property is sitting on a hardware store shelf right now, sold by the foot for the price of a coffee. The story of copper is not the story of a miracle product. It is the story of a forgotten principle. Modern hygiene was built on the idea that cleanliness is a chemical you buy, apply, and replace. The older idea, preserved in copper drinking cups, in copper door handles, in copper smelter workshops, was that cleanliness can be a property of the material itself. Both ideas are valuable. The mistake was choosing one and forgetting the other. A bathroom drain is a small place. It is also the place where a 6,000-year-old principle quietly meets a modern problem. For the cost of a coffee, a piece of bare copper wire turns a passive surface into an active one. Not a final answer, but a steady, ancient counterweight to the biology that thrives in the corners of every home. If this video pulled back the curtain on something useful, hit subscribe. Send it to someone whose bathroom could use an upgrade. And keep questioning the obvious. The most powerful tools have a habit of hiding behind the most familiar surfaces. This is Oracle Prime. Until next time.